a sealed envelope, a handwritten clause, and a decision so final that even senior palace lawyers went quiet when they read it. That is where this story begins, not with a public announcement, not with a press conference, but with a document that had been inside of a protected royal archive for years, waiting for exactly the right moment to be opened. When Prince William finally activated Queen Elizabeth's private covenant, the reaction inside Buckingham Palace was not confusion. It was something closer to dread, because the people who read those pages understood immediately what the Queen had done, and, more importantly, what she had been quietly preparing for all along. The estate at the center of this story is worth an estimated £200 million. It had never appeared in standard royal property listings. It was never discussed alongside Balmoral or Sandringham. For years, it existed in near total silence, buried beneath private covenants and legal structures that kept it off the public record completely. Even some senior palace officials reportedly had no idea of its full scale until the transfer began, and when William took exclusive control of it, with a set of restrictions so specific they could only have been written with one person in mind, the target became immediately obvious. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, was permanently blocked. Not sidelined, not delayed, blocked from any advisory role, any operational access, any future involvement connected to the estate network. The directive reportedly gave no room for appeal, no window for negotiation, and no path back in. One palace insider used a single word to describe what those restrictions felt like once the legal team finished reviewing them: irreversible. That word spread through palace corridors faster than any official statement could have, because everyone inside those walls understood what it meant. The Queen had not simply left William a fortune. She had handed him a weapon and left very clear instructions about how to use it. What many people don't realize is how quietly all of this actually happened. Buckingham Palace released the initial announcement with almost no fanfare. The language was measured, formal, deliberately understated. But behind those carefully chosen words, royal circles were anything but calm. Longtime palace staff described the atmosphere in the days that followed as deeply unsettling. People who had spent decades navigating royal politics suddenly found themselves unsure of where the lines had moved. The estate had never been openly discussed. It had never been part of any public conversation about royal inheritance. And yet, once its existence became known, the scale of what the Queen had built around it shocked even people who thought they understood how the monarchy operated. Security protocols reportedly changed almost overnight. Archive access was restricted. Administrative oversight shifted directly under William's authority, and the people who had previously moved freely through those channels suddenly found doors closing. Some observers initially tried to frame this as a routine transition, the natural transfer of private assets following a monarch's death. But the more details that surfaced, the harder that framing became to hold. The restrictions were too specific, the legal architecture was too deliberate, and the timing, given everything that had been quietly circulating through palace advisory circles in the years before, was impossible to call coincidental. By the time the full picture began to emerge, one thing was already clear. This had been planned. And it had been planned for a very long time. Let's talk about what really happened in the years before any of this became public. Between 2017 and 2021, Prince William made several quiet visits to properties connected to the hidden estate. These trips did not appear on official royal schedules. There were no press releases, no photo opportunities, no public statements. To anyone watching from the outside, they registered as nothing. But inside the estate grounds, those visits were anything but routine. According to accounts from people familiar with the arrangement, Queen Elizabeth personally walked William through archive chambers, wartime records, and private collections tied to the monarchy's deeper history. She showed him documents most people inside the palace had never seen. She walked him through the legal structure of the covenant itself. Clause by clause, condition by condition, she explained not just what the estate was, but why it had been built the way it was. Former aides later described those sessions as something closer to preparation than education. William was not being shown around a family property. He was being trained to protect something the Queen believed was genuinely at risk. That detail changes everything about how this story reads. Because if William was learning how to defend the estate years before any public conflict emerged, then the Queen must have already believed a conflict was coming. So what had she seen? The answer to that question lies in a set of proposals that quietly circulated among advisors connected to Camilla and Tom Parker Bowles. Proposals that never became official royal policy, but apparently caused serious concern at the highest levels of the palace. What many people don't know is that these plans were not vague or exploratory. According to insiders familiar with the discussions, they were detailed enough to have reached foreign investors. The concepts reportedly centered on transforming sections of protected royal property into high-end lifestyle experiences. Exclusive countryside retreats built around royal heritage, premium food branding tied to estate farmland, and potential partnership conversations that apparently included interests from the Middle East and parts of Europe. To some, these ideas probably like smart modernization, a way to make the monarchy financially relevant in a changing world. To the Queen, they apparently sounded like something else entirely. Palace insiders claimed Elizabeth became increasingly uncomfortable with any framework that treated royal heritage as a product, not because she was opposed to the monarchy adapting. She had overseen 70 years of adaptation, but because she drew a firm line between evolution and commercialization. One was necessary. The other, in her view, was dangerous. She reportedly saw certain financial ambitions as fundamentally incompatible with the long-term survival of the institution itself. That fear appears to explain why the covenant language was written the way it was. The phrase that reportedly stunned royal archivists was unusual enough to stick in people's memories. The restriction allegedly referred to what the Queen described as non-direct legacy interests, wording so careful and so specific that palace advisors understood its target immediately, even without a name attached. One note found in the Queen's handwritten annotations allegedly described stewardship as protection from ambition disguised as service. That sentence circulated quietly among senior staff. And for people who had followed the conversations surrounding the estate proposals, it did not feel abstract. By the time William formally inherited control of the estate, the Queen's preparation had made one thing impossible to miss. She had not been reacting to a problem. She had been anticipating one. The moment William formally activated the covenant, the atmosphere inside the palace changed in ways that are difficult to describe from the outside. Publicly, everything looked composed. Statements were measured. Appearances remained carefully managed. The monarchy projected exactly the kind of stability it always projects during difficult internal moments. Behind closed doors, it was a different picture entirely. Queen Camilla reportedly sought legal clarification almost immediately. Advisors were instructed to examine every clause, every trust condition, every procedural detail for possible weaknesses. Legal teams went through the documents carefully and thoroughly. What they found, according to sources familiar with the process, was not encouraging. The Queen's protections were not broad or loosely worded. They were layered, detailed, and specifically constructed to survive exactly the kind of challenge that was now being attempted. Some provisions extended beyond the immediate transfer. They reportedly limited future influence from individuals outside the direct hereditary line tied to the estate's stewardship. Wording that made any serious legal challenge extraordinarily difficult without directly confronting the documented wishes of the late Queen herself. That reality hit hard. Princess Anne reportedly played a significant role during this period. Sources familiar with the process claimed she helped review sealed correspondence, authenticated handwritten directives, and supported William's authority over the transfer in ways that carried real weight inside royal circles. Her involvement mattered because Anne had long been regarded as one of the most trusted figures in the late Queen's private circle. When she aligned with William's position, internal resistance began to collapse. One by one, advisors who had initially questioned the severity of the restrictions reportedly backed away once they read the documents more closely. King Charles found himself in an almost impossible position. On one side stood his wife and her son, dealing with restrictions they experienced as severe and humiliating. On the other stood William, operating with the full authority of his grandmother's documented intentions. Any public alignment in either direction risked deepening fractures the family was already struggling to manage privately. By most accounts, Charles stayed quiet. And that silence, for many people watching from inside palace walls, said everything. Meanwhile, Tom Parker Bowles found his remaining connections to the estate completely severed. People previously linked to advisory discussions or branding conversations were removed from operational channels. No public accusations were made. No dramatic statements were issued, but the effect was absolute. Staff members who witnessed the transition described the atmosphere using words like ice cold. Communication between royal households became formal and cautious in ways that went beyond normal institutional distance. Even routine conversations apparently carried an undertone that was hard to ignore. Some insiders began to suggest the conflict had moved far beyond a dispute over property and entered genuinely personal territory. About trust, about legitimacy, and about whose vision of the monarchy's future was going to survive. By the time the final phase of the estate transfer was complete, the real meaning of what Queen Elizabeth had done was no longer possible to debate. She had not simply protected wealth or land. She had built a permanent structural barrier around an entire vision of what the monarchy should be, and she had entrusted one person to enforce it. The anti-commercial clauses written into the covenant were among the most comprehensive palace advisors had ever seen attached to private royal property. They prohibited future reclassification of the estate. They blocked external partnerships. They prevented any commercial licensing tied to the estate's historical identity. And they placed the entire structure under what insiders described as ethical stewardship directives, a framework focused entirely on preservation and historical continuity rather than profitability or expansion. Reversing that system, legal experts quietly acknowledged, would now be extraordinarily difficult. William made several visits to the estate in the weeks that followed, accompanied by Catherine and their children. No press events, no staged appearances. Just the family walking through the grounds in a way that felt, to observers watching from a distance, less like a celebration and more like a quiet acknowledgement of responsibility. He never made a triumphant public statement about what he had inherited. He issued no dramatic declarations. He did not publicly confront Camilla or Tom. He simply let the Queen's documents speak for him. And for many people watching, that restraint was the most revealing thing about the entire situation. Accounts from journalists and palace insiders suggest William had understood for years that this moment was coming. The visits during 2017 to 2021, the private briefings inside archive chambers, the conversations that never appeared on official schedules, all of it pointed toward a man who had been quietly preparing to be a guardian, not just an heir. What the wider public saw as a sudden inheritance dispute, the people closest to the palace understood as the final stage of a strategy the Queen had been building for the better part of a decade. She had watched the monarchy change around her. She had watched commercial culture creep closer to institutions she had spent her entire reign defending. And she had decided, sometime in her final years, that the most important thing she could do was make certain that someone she trusted completely would be standing at the gate when the pressure came. That person was William. For Camilla and Tom, the consequences of that decision remain real and lasting. The estate doors are closed. The restrictions are permanent. The legal pathway back, if one exists at all, runs directly through challenges to the documented wishes of the most respected monarch in living memory, a route that few advisors appear willing to recommend. And in royal circles, a quiet question continues to circulate. Not about the legal outcome, which appears settled, but about what it all reveals beneath the surface. Did the Queen fear specific people? Or did she fear something larger? A slow drift toward a version of the monarchy that looked modern on the outside, but had quietly become something for sale. That question does not have a clean answer. What the covenant suggests is that Elizabeth was worried about both at once. She feared the commercialization of something sacred, and she feared the people she believed might allow it to happen. What appeared to be a family inheritance battle turned out to be something the monarchy had never quite seen before. A queen's final act of governance, carried out not from a throne or a podium but from a sealed envelope in a private archive, delivered years after her death, exactly when she intended it to arrive. These stories provide insight into how power inside the British monarchy has always worked at its deepest level, not through public announcements or dramatic confrontations, but through quiet preparation, trusted relationships, and decisions made long before anyone outside the walls ever realizes a battle has begun.